The Force binds all things across the galaxy, connecting every living being in an invisible web of light and dark, life and death. But the Force has limits. It cannot bind what was never born of it. And on the night the sky over the Junland Waste split open, something arrived that the Force itself recoiled from. No hyperspace beacon registered the intrusion. No Republic sensor net flagged an anomaly. There was only a tear, a wound in the fabric between realities, hanging for less than 4 seconds above Tatooine's twin suns before it sealed itself shut. Through that wound fell a shape that had no business existing in this galaxy. A black cube, kilometers across. Its hull a lattice of dead black alloy and pulsing green conduits, trailing fire and shattered plating as it plunged toward the desert below. It struck the Junland wastes with the force of a small moon. Sand liquefied to glass in a ring 3 kilometers wide. The shockwave rattled moisture farms as far as the Lars homestead, cracked ancient stone in long-buried Tuscan burial grounds, and sent a tremor through the Force that every sensitive being on the planet felt as a cold, wrong silence, as though something had reached into the web of life and simply cut a thread. This was the Borg Collective, or what remained of it. The cube had been mid-pursuit through Species 8472's fluidic space when a Borg transwarp conduit destabilized, hurling the vessel through subspace layers no drone had cataloged and colliding it, by pure catastrophic chance, with a fracture in hyperspace itself. The crossing had gutted the cube's systems. Regeneration alcoves flickered and died by the thousands. Long-range transwarp coils were slag. Whole decks had lost power. Whole subprocessor arrays had gone dark, and the vast, singular consciousness that was the collective found itself, for the first time in its existence, cut off, stranded, wounded. Alone in a galaxy it had zero data on. But a wounded Borg cube was still a Borg cube. Within the hour, drones began to move. They emerged from ruptured hull sections into the twin sun dusk, their servos whining against sand and heat, their optical implants sweeping the horizon with cold, mechanical patience. Assimilation nanoprobes hummed in their subdermal tubules, hungry for genetic material, technological data, anything that could be added to the collective's diminished processing base. Perfection, to the Borg, meant survival. Survival meant absorption. And Tatooine, backwater, sunblasted, teeming with moisture farmers, Jawas, hut cartels, and old Republic hardware, looked, to the collective's calculus, like raw material. The first Jawa scavenging party to stumble on the wreckage never sent a distress signal. Their sandcrawler simply went silent on the trade band, and by morning its systems had been stripped, rewired, and folded into something that pulsed with the same sickly green light as the cube itself. Word of the impossible ship traveled fast in the underworld, channels that stretched across Tatooine's crime syndicates, and it reached ears far more dangerous than Jawa traders. Count Dooku had come to Tatooine for reasons that had nothing to do with fallen stars. A decade into his quiet architecture of galactic collapse, the former Jedi Master was chasing a lead on a separatist financier hiding among the huts, tying threads that would, in time, tighten into war. He received the report from Jango Fett with the same detached curiosity he applied to most anomalies until the description reached him. A vessel of no known registry, cubic, kilometers in scale, radiating an energy signature his tactical droids could not classify. Dooku's interest sharpened immediately. Unknown technology of that scale, in the hands of the Confederacy, could shift the balance of a war not yet declared. Investigate it, he told Jango, standing in the dim cabin of his ship in orbit. Coruscant's coming storm the furthest thing from either of their minds now. Quietly, if it is a weapon, I want to know who built it and whether it can be taken. Jango Fett, ever the professional, said nothing about instinct or unease. He simply nodded, checked the charge on his weapons, and set his ship on a course for the Junland wastes, unaware that he was flying towards something that did not negotiate, did not retreat, and did not recognize the concept of a contract. Below, in the long shadow of twin suns setting over the Lars homestead, Shmi Skywalker stepped out onto the porch and felt something she couldn't name settle over the desert like a held breath. She had lived on Tatooine long enough to know its moods, the storms, the raids, the the silence before a sandstorm. This was none of those. This was colder, older, wrong in a way the Force itself seemed to flinch from. She wrapped her shawl tighter and looked west, toward the wastes, toward a horizon where, faint and impossible, a green light pulsed against the dark. 9 years earlier, she had let her son go, trusting the galaxy to carry him somewhere better than this. Tonight, some instinct older than fear told her the galaxy had just sent something back. Jango Fett had faced down Jedi, rival bounty hunters, and the political machinery of a dying republic without breaking stride. He had not, until this night, faced something that made his instincts scream. Retreat before he'd even fired a shot. His ship, Slave Eye, set down 2 kilometers from the crash site. Close enough to observe, far enough to run if the situation demanded it. A habit of caution that had kept him alive through 100 contracts. Through his helmet scanners, the wreckage resolved into something that defied every schematic in his considerable mental library. The cube's hull, even shattered, radiated a low electromagnetic hum that interfered with his targeting systems. Green light pulsed along cracked seams like something breathing. He advanced on foot, blaster rifle steady. Boots sinking into glass-fused sand still radiating heat from the impact. The silence out here was absolute. No wildlife. No wind. Not even the distant chitter of womp rats. Whatever had crashed here had emptied the desert of every living thing smart enough to flee. That was when he saw the moisture farmer. The man, Jango's scanner tagged him as a local, mid-30s. Unremarkable, stood motionless at the edge of the crater, facing the wreckage with his back to Jango. That alone was strange. No farmer walked toward a crashed starship of unknown origin without weapons, without caution, without so much as a backward glance at the homestead he'd surely left behind. "You," Jango called out, weapon raised. "Turn around." Slowly, the farmer turned. Jango had seen death in every form the galaxy offered, clean and brutal, quick and lingering. He had never seen this. Where the man's left I should have been. A mechanical implant pulsed with cold light, threaded with cabling that disappeared beneath skin gone pale and waxen. Tubules, thin as needle wire, had fused into his neck and jaw. His remaining organic eye held no fear, no recognition. Nothing that Jango could read as human. When the farmer spoke, it was in a flat chorus of overlapping voices, as though a dozen throats spoke through one mouth in perfect unison. "You will be assimilated. Your biological and technological distinctiveness will be added to our own. Resistance is futile." Jango didn't wait for a second sentence. He put 3 shots into the assimilated farmer's chest, center mass. Textbook lethal spacing. The man staggered, sparked, and kept walking. That had never happened before. Not to Jango Fett. He adjusted, aimed for the mechanical eye, fired again. The shot connected, shattered the implant in a spray of green fluid and shorting circuitry, and still the farmer came on. One arm extending, tubules exposed and hungry, reaching for Jango's exposed forearm with mechanical precision. Jango's training took over before conscious thought could. He sidestepped, drove a vibroblade up under the farmer's jaw. And this time the body finally dropped, twitching, systems failing in a cascade of sparks and dying green light. He stood over the corpse, breathing hard behind his helmet, an admission of exertion he would never voice aloud. And keyed his calm. "Dooku, this isn't a weapon. It's an infection." Static answered him first, then the Count's voice. Cool and measured as always, though something in it sharpened at Jango's report. "Explain." Jango described what he'd seen, the drone, the resilience, the chorus voice, the tubules that turned a man into something else entirely. He did not editorialize. He had learned long ago that Dooku wanted facts, not fear, though Jango privately noted that this was the first contract in years that had put something close to fear in his own chest. There was a long pause on the other end. "Interesting," Dooku said finally, and Jango could hear the calculation behind the word. The same calculation that had turned a Jedi Master into a Sith Lord, that saw opportunity in every catastrophe. A technology that converts biological matter into a controlled, networked resource. Do you understand what such a thing could mean for the Confederacy's war effort? Fett, an army that cannot be bargained with, cannot be bribed, cannot defect. It's not technology you control, Jango said flatly. It's technology that controls you. Every weapon has a wielder. If one is clever enough to find the trigger. Dooku's tone turned decisive. I want a sample. Living tissue. Functioning implants. Something Separatist Science Division can study. Retrieve it, and return to the rendezvous point. And Fett, avoid direct contact with the larger structure. I suspect it is more than a downed ship. Jango disconnected without argument. Though every instinct honed over a lifetime of contracts told him this was the first job he should walk away from. He didn't know, as he moved deeper into the crash zone, that a kilometer away, drones had already begun fanning out toward the nearest settlements, toward homesteads, toward moisture farms, toward a woman standing on a porch, who had felt this coming before the first shot was ever fired. He didn't know that Count Dooku, for all his political brilliance, was about to make the gravest miscalculation of his long and calculating life. And in the Junlin wastes, in the deep dark where the cube's core still pulsed with wounded, patient hunger, something vast and singular had already begun cataloging Tatooine's population, adding it to the list, assessing distinctiveness, preparing to add it to its own. Dawn broke over Tatooine's twin suns to find the Junland wastes transformed. What had been empty desert the night before now bore the unmistakable signature of Borg expansion. Skeletal support struts, grown rather than built, radiated outward from the crash site like the legs of some vast insect. Scavenged technology, a Jawa sandcrawler's drive core, stripped moisture vaporators. The shattered remains of a dozen speeder bikes had been fused into the growing structure, repurposed with mechanical efficiency that offended every law of engineering. Jango Fett understood. The cube's regeneration was slow, hampered by its transwarp injuries, but it was not stopped. Given enough raw material and enough time, the collective would rebuild. Jango watched from a ridge half a kilometer out, cataloging drone patrol patterns with a hunter's patience. He counted 11, moving in overlapping sweeps, each one a former inhabitant of Tatooine now, reduced to component parts of something larger. A Jawa, 2 moisture farmers. What might once have been a pod racing mechanic, judging by the scarred flight suit fused beneath the implants. He had his sample already, tissue and circuitry, harvested from the drone he'd killed, sealed in a stasis case clipped to his belt. Every instinct told him to leave now, deliver the sample, collect his fee, and let the Confederacy's scientists deal with the nightmare he'd stumbled into. But Dooku's orders had been explicit, and Jango Fett's reputation was built on completing contracts, not abandoning them at the first sign of difficulty. He was still weighing the risk when the waste gave him no more time to decide. A patrol drone, the former pod racing mechanic, its face a ruin of grafted circuitry, turned in his direction with mechanical precision, optical sensors locking on his position with unnerving certainty. It should not have been able to detect him at this range, behind rock cover, emitting no signal. But the collective didn't hunt the way organic predators did. It adapted in real time, sharing sensory data across every connected node, learning Jango's heat signature, his movement pattern, his very existence. The instant one drone registered him. Designation, biological, technologically enhanced. Assimilation priority, high. The drone's voice, flat, chorus-layered. Indifferent, carried across the sand as 3 more patrol units altered course toward Jango's position. He didn't wait to be surrounded. Jango triggered his jetpack, rocketing skyward in a burst of thrust, and opened fire from the air with the kind of precision that had made him one of the deadliest bounty hunters in the galaxy. His shots found joints, optical implants, exposed circuitry, every vulnerability a lifetime of combat had taught him to exploit. 2 drones went down permanently, sparking and still in the sand. The third kept coming, absorbing damage that would have killed anything organic, adapting its shielding in real time. Jango watched, with something like grudging respect, as the drone's outer plating shifted frequency mid-fight, and his next shot simply glanced off, deflected by a modulation his weapons hadn't accounted for. Adaptation. Mid-combat. He'd never faced an enemy that rewrote its own defenses between engagements. He was forced to fall back, jetpack burning hot, putting distance between himself and a threat that learned faster than he could improvise a first in a career built on being the one who adapted quicker than anyone else in the room. It was in that retreat, skimming low over a ridge of red rock. That Django witnessed. The moment that would linger in his memory longer than any battle he'd fought before or since. Below him, in a shallow ravine, a drone had cornered a settler, a young man, barely out of his teens, who'd clearly fled his family's homestead when the tremors woke him in the night. The boy was unarmed, backed against rock, his terror visible even from Django's altitude. The drone did not kill him. It extended tubules from its forearm with clinical patience, and the boy's screaming cut off in seconds. As neural shock took his consciousness, Django watched the process complete in real time, skin paling, veins darkening beneath the surface as nanoprobes flooded his bloodstream. A mechanical eye implant blooming grotesquely across the boy's face like some obscene flower. Within 90 seconds, the terrified teenager was gone, and something else stood in his place, designation assigned, distinctiveness cataloged. One more voice folded silently into the collective's endless chorus. Django Fett had killed for money more times than he could count. He had never watched anything like this, the deliberate, patient erasure of a person, not through death, but through something worse than death. He found himself gripping his blaster tighter than the situation strictly required, an anger he didn't examine too closely rising beneath his professional calm. He broke off the engagement and burned hard for Slave Eye. Sample case secure, mission technically complete. But as he cleared the crash zone's outer perimeter, his calm crackled with Dooku's voice, and Django found himself, for the first time in a long career of moral flexibility, hesitating before he answered. Report your position, Fett. Have you retrieved the sample? Django looked back once at the ravine, at the place where a boy had stopped being a boy. Sample secure, he said. But Count, you need to hear what this thing actually does before you decide you want it. Dooku's silence stretched a beat too long before he replied. Return to the rendezvous. We will discuss capability, not conscience. Fett, that has never been part of your contract. Django said nothing, but somewhere beneath the Beskar and the professional detachment, a line had been drawn that he would not fully understand himself until the following night, a night that would put him between a hive mind that erased identity and a small, quiet woman on a moisture farm who had never asked to be anyone's battlefield. Dooku received the sample aboard his ship in orbit, and for the first time in years, Django Fett saw something close to genuine fascination cross the old Sith Lord's face. The stasis case sat open on the cabin's central table, its contents pulsing faintly with residual bioelectric charge, fragments of nanoprobe circuitry, a sliver of assimilated tissue still knitted through with mechanical filament. Dooku turned a scanning wand over it slowly, murmuring calculations under his breath, his mind already 3 steps ahead into strategic possibility. Remarkable, he said. Self-replicating nanotechnology capable of rewriting organic matter at the cellular level. Do you understand the applications, Fett? An army immune to fear, to bribery, to the 1,000 small betrayals that plague every military force in this galaxy. If this technology could be isolated, controlled. It can't be controlled, Django said, sharper than his usual professional flatness allowed. I watched it take a boy apart in 90 seconds. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't have a price. You send separatist scientists down there to isolate it. You're not going to get a weapon, Count. You're going to get assimilated. Dooku set the scanning wand down with deliberate care, studying his hunter with the cool appraisal he usually reserved for political rivals. Your objection is noted, but I did not survive the fall of the Jedi Order by fearing the unfamiliar. Every power in this galaxy was, at some point, an unknown force that wiser men called uncontrollable. He moved to the viewport, hands clasped behind his back. Coruscant's distant political theater a world, away from the horror unfolding. On the sands below, I will go myself. A Sith Lord's power is not so easily cataloged by primitive scanning technology, and I have resources this collective cannot anticipate. It was, Django would later reflect, the single greatest miscalculation of Count Dooku's long and calculating life. They descended together at dusk. Dooku's personal shuttle, setting down at the crash sites. Perimeter undercover of a sandstorm rolling in from the western dunes. Dooku moved through the ruin of fused technology and grown alloy structures with the unhurried confidence of a man who had faced down Jedi masters and lived lightsaber hilt cool against his palm. The force a steady current beneath his contempt for lesser threats. The drones that intercepted them were not impressed by his confidence. 3 assimilation units emerged from the structure's shadowed entrance, moving with the same terrible synchronization Jango had witnessed the night before. Dooku ignited his lightsaber, crimson blade humming to life, and moved to meet them with the economy of motion that had made him one of the deadliest duelists in galactic history. His first strike bisected a drone cleanly, the force lending speed and precision no mechanical opponent should have been able to match. The second drone he impaled through its central processing core, the blade's plasma cauterizing the wound instantly. For a moment, it looked as though the Count's confidence had been entirely justified. Then the third drone reached him. It moved differently than the others, faster, its plating already adapted to resist blaster fire, and Jango realized with dawning horror, apparently learning from the 2 units that had just died. Dooku's blade connected with its forearm and found the plating had shifted resonance mid-swing, deflecting the cut that should have severed the limb. The drone's counterstrike caught Dooku's offhand, tubules piercing through his sleeve and into flesh before he could pull free. Dooku tore away with a snarl, flooding his bloodstream with force energy to fight the intrusion. But even a Sith Lord's will was, for one terrible moment, not enough. Jango watched the Count stagger, watched something pale and mechanical bloom faintly along the injected vein before. Dooku, with visible effort, forced a surge of dark side power through the wound and burned the nanoprobes out through sheer violent will, a feat Jango suspected no ordinary being could have survived. Dooku dispatched the drone a heartbeat later, blade finding its optical core, but the damage to his composure was done. He stood amid the wreckage, breathing hard, staring at the cauterized wound on his forearm with an expression Jango had never seen on the Count's face before, something close to fear. The collective adapts to combat data in real time, Dooku said, voice tight with the effort of masking what had just happened. It is not merely networked. It is learning from every engagement, refining its defenses collectively. This is not a weapon to be seized, Fett. It is a plague that seizes weapons. That's what I told you, Jango said, and did not bother hiding the edge in his voice this time. Dooku said nothing to that. He turned instead toward the crash site's dark heart, toward the pulsing green glow that marked the cube's damaged core. And Jango saw the calculation shift behind the Sith Lord's eyes, from acquisition to something colder, more pragmatic. Containment, destruction, whatever it took to keep this thing from spreading beyond the waste before it finished rebuilding itself into something unstoppable. We require a different approach, Dooku said finally. I will contact Geonosis. If this collective cannot be controlled, it must be eliminated before it recovers full capacity and before word of its existence reaches the Jedi Council or the Republic Senate. He looked at Jango with something almost like respect. You were right to be cautious, Fett. See that it does not happen again. Behind them, deeper in the ruin, the cube's core pulsed once, twice, and across every connected drone on Tatooine's surface. A single directive propagated through the collective's networked consciousness. Biological specimens of significant genetic and technological distinctiveness detected. Designation, Sith. Assimilation priority, maximum. The hunt had only just begun, and neither Dooku nor Jango yet knew that the collective's expanding sensor sweep had already logged a second signature entirely. A small moisture farm on the edge of the wastes, and a woman standing at its center whose connection to something vast and unquantifiable made her, in the collective's cold calculus, the most interesting specimen on the entire planet. Shmi Skywalker had not slept in 2 nights. It wasn't fear exactly, though fear was part of it, coiled tight beneath her ribs since the night the sky had torn open over the wastes. It was something older and harder to name, a wrongness she felt, through the same quiet sense that had always let her know. Somehow, when Anakin was hurting even from a galaxy away, that sense had never left her, not in 9 years of silence. And now it screamed at her every time she looked west toward the dunes. She had tried to explain it to Klieg Lars over breakfast, watching him frown into his CAF as she described the feeling, not sandstorm, not raiders, something else, something that didn't belong. Klieg was a practical man, a good man. But practicality had no language for what Shmi was trying to describe. And she'd watched the concern in his eyes shade slowly into the particular patience people reserved for someone they loved, but didn't quite believe. The scouts haven't reported anything unusual, he'd said gently. Just the tremor. Probably a meteor or old Republic hardware coming down. She hadn't argued further, but she hadn't stopped watching the horizon either. On the second morning, Shmi did something she rarely allowed herself. She rode out alone, on the homestead's oldest speeder bike, toward the edge of their claimed territory, telling Klieg only that she needed to check the southern vaporators. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. And guilt sat uneasily beside the pull she couldn't ignore. She found the first sign of wrongness 4 kilometers out. A moisture farmer's homestead, one she recognized distantly from trade routes, standing dark and silent in the mid-morning heat. No smoke from the cooking vents. No droids moving between the vaporators. She approached carefully, calling out, and found only an overturned chair on the porch and a door left open to the wind. The family was simply gone. Not dead. She would have recognized death, its particular silence. This was different. Absence without explanation. As though the house had exhaled its occupants and forgotten they'd ever existed. Shmi's hand found the small knife she kept at her belt. More habit than real protection against whatever this was. And she was turning to leave when she saw the tracks in the sand, not boot prints. Not the wide pads of a dewback, but something narrower, mechanical, dragging faint lines between each precise footfall. They led west, toward the wastes, toward whatever had fallen from the sky 2 nights before. She followed them for perhaps 100 meters before the feeling stopped her cold, that same wrongness from her sleepless nights, but concentrated now, close enough to taste, like ozone before a storm, and beneath it, threaded through the wrongness like a discordant note in a familiar song, something that made her breath catch. The force itself seemed to recoil from whatever lay ahead. Not evil. Exactly. She had felt evil before, had sensed the hut's casual cruelty and worse in her years of slavery. This was different. This didn't hate. It didn't want anything from her at all except to stop being what she was and start being something else entirely. It was absence wearing the shape of purpose, and every instinct the Force had ever given her screamed to run. She ran, not toward the wrongness, but back toward her speeder, back toward the homestead, back toward Klieg and Owen, and the small circle of safety she'd built in her exile from slavery. She rode hard, sand spraying behind her, and didn't slow until the Lars homestead rose familiar and solid against the horizon. Klieg met her at the door, alarm plain on his face at the state of her, wind-blown, pale, hands trembling faintly on the speeder's controls. "Shmi, what happened?" "We need to gather the settlers," she said, breathless, the words tumbling out faster than she could organize them into something that would sound rational, rather than desperate. "The Dorn homestead, the whole family is gone. Not raided. Gone. Klieg, like they were never there at all. And there's something out in the waste that isn't. It isn't like anything I've ever felt." Klieg's brow furrowed, with the particular worry of a man who loved his wife and didn't know how to hold both that love and his own uncertainty about what she was describing. "Gone how? Slavers? The Tuscans?" "No." Shmi shook her head, frustrated at her own inability to translate a feeling into evidence he could act on. "I don't have proof. I just have. I know something is wrong, the way I've always known things. Please, Klieg, send word to the other homesteads. Tell them to stay close, stay armed, stay together until we understand what's happening." To his credit, Klieg didn't dismiss her outright, though she could see the calculation behind his eyes. The cost of alarming their neighbors over a feeling weighed against the cost of ignoring a warning that had, in 9 years of marriage, never once proven false. "I'll send Owen to the Darklighter place," he said finally, "and I'll ride out to warn the Fortuna homestead myself." "But Shmi," he caught her hands, steadying their tremor with his own calloused grip. "If something's really out there, you stay here. Understand? Whatever it is, I'm not losing you to it." She wanted to promise him that. She wanted, more than anything, to simply agree and let herself be protected, the way she'd let herself be protected so rarely in a life, defined by servitude and sacrifice. But even as she nodded, some deeper current beneath the Force's warning told her that promise would not hold, that whatever was gathering itself in the Junland wastes had already noticed her, had already begun, in its vast and patient calculus, to consider what a woman who could sense its coming might be worth to a collective that valued distinctiveness above all things. Somewhere in the wreckage a day's ride away, a directive propagated silently through 10,000 network processes. Target acquired. Biological signature, anomalous. Force sensitivity detected. Designation unprecedented in collective archives. Assimilation priority, maximum. The hunt that would define the next 3 nights on Tatooine had just found its true objective. Count Dooku's shuttle broke atmosphere 12 hours later, carrying with it something the collective had not encountered before in its long, assimilative history, a being who intended not to conquer it, but to erase it entirely. He had spent the flight from orbit in cold calculation, forearms still faintly aching where the nanoprobes had burned out under dark side fire, turning over strategy. With the same ruthless clarity he applied to Senate manipulation and Jedi entrapment alike. The collective could not be bargained with. That lesson had cost him nearly his life. But it could, perhaps, be destroyed if approached correctly. A cube of that mass, however damaged, would have a core. Every complex system had a heart. A weakness, a single point where enough force applied in the right place could unmake the whole. He had requisitioned droid support from a nearby Separatist staging depot, a full squad of B-2 Super battle droids and 2 experimental EMP charges designed to disable Republic shielding, repurposed now for a very different application. It was not the elegant solution Dooku preferred, but elegance was a luxury for enemies who could be reasoned with. And the collective, he had concluded, could not. Jango Fett met him at the perimeter, having spent the intervening hours doing what he did best, scouting, cataloging, learning the enemy's patterns with the patient thoroughness that had made him the galaxy's most sought bounty hunter. His report was grim. Drone counts up since last night. Whatever's rebuilding down there is rebuilding fast. He gestured toward the crash site, visible now as a spreading lattice of grown alloy structures, pulsing faintly green in the dusk. And it's not just hunting randomly anymore. Patrols are converging on something specific, southeast quadrant. Looks coordinated. Dooku's eyes narrowed. Coordinated toward what? Don't know yet, but I guess whatever it is, it matters to them more than random assimilation. Jango's voice carried something Dooku hadn't heard from his hunter before, a note of genuine unease, quickly suppressed beneath professional flatness. Count, I've been doing this a long time. I've never seen anything adapt to combat data this fast. Every hour we wait, it gets harder to kill. Then we do not wait. Dooku signaled the droid squad forward. EMP charges secured to a modified assault platform. The core lies at the structure's center, judging by energy readings. We breach, we plant the charges, we withdraw before the blast radius catches us. Simple in principle. Nothing about the next hour proved simple. The droid squad advanced under Dooku's force-enhanced perception, cutting through drone patrols with mechanical efficiency that briefly suggested the plan might actually succeed. B-2 units, immune to the neural shock that had claimed the terrified teenager 2 nights prior, tore through assimilation drones with heavy blaster cannons. And for the first time since the cube's arrival, the collectives, local forces found themselves genuinely outmatched by conventional weaponry. But the collective learned. By the 4th engagement, drones had begun targeting the droids. Central processors with the same adaptive precision they'd shown against Dooku's lightsaber, exploiting weaknesses in Separatist armor plating that should have taken weeks of analysis to identify. 3 B-2 units fell in as many minutes. Their chassis converted into raw material even as their comrades fought on, until Dooku found himself pressing deeper into the structure, with barely half his droid support and Jango covering the rear. Jetpack thrusters whining with strain. They reached the outer edge of the core chamber as the sandstorm Dooku had used for cover finally broke. Howling winds masking the sound of their approach, and what Dooku saw within stopped even his considerable composure cold. The core was not merely a machine. It pulsed with something that felt, disturbingly, alive, a vast neural lattice suspended in green-lit fluid, threaded through with millions of individual consciousnesses folded into a single processing whole. Dooku had spent decades studying the Force in all its permutations, light and dark, and he recognized, with the particular horror of a man confronting something genuinely beyond his frame of reference, that this was a kind of unity, corrupted, mechanical, utterly without the individual will the Force so prized, but unity nonetheless. A dark mirror of everything the Jedi claimed to seek and everything the Sith claimed to reject. Plant the charges, he said, voice tighter than he intended. Now, the remaining droids moved to comply, and the core, sensing the threat with whatever passed for awareness in its vast networked mind, responded instantly. A pulse of energy rippled outward from the lattice, and every drone within the structure converged on the intruders simultaneously, abandoning their patrol patterns in a coordinated swarm that Dooku's tactical mind recognized, with grim appreciation, as a perfect defensive response. He ignited his lightsaber and met them, force lightning crackling from his free hand in arcs that dropped drone after drone. But for every unit destroyed, two more emerged from side passages Dooku hadn't accounted for. Jango fought beside him, jetpack granting him mobility the ground-bound drones couldn't match. But even Jango's precision was being tested past its limits. Charges are placed, Jango shouted over the storm's howl, and the drone's chorus-voiced advance. We need to go now. Dooku cut down the last drone between himself and the exit, but as he turned to withdraw, the core pulsed once more, brighter this time, almost frantic, and a directive he could not have anticipated propagated through every remaining drone on the surface, redirecting their priorities in an instant. Deep in his calculating mind, Dooku understood, a beat too late, that the collective had just made a choice of its own, abandon the fight for its core, and redirect every available drone toward the target it had already identified as more valuable than survival itself, toward a moisture farm on the edge of the wastes, toward a woman whose connection to something the collective could not comprehend had just become, in its cold and desperate calculus, worth more than the core Dooku was seconds from destroying. The explosion that tore through the collective's core lit the night sky over the Junland, waste like a second dying sun. Dooku and Jango cleared the blast radius with seconds to spare, the shockwave hurling sand and shattered alloys skyward as the structure's central lattice ruptured in a cascade of failing systems. For a moment, standing amid the storm's howling aftermath, it looked as though the threat had ended as decisively as it began. The pulsing green light that had marked the crash site for 2 nights finally guttering into darkness. But Dooku had seen the redirection order propagate before the charges detonated, and he understood, with the particular cold clarity that had made him a master strategist, that destroying the core had not destroyed the collective's will. It had only fractured it, scattered its processing, across whatever drones remained active, each one now operating on the last directive it had received, before the connection frayed. Assimilate the anomaly, whatever cost, whatever remained. Fet. Dooku's voice cut through the storm's dying wind. The drones that broke off before the blast, where were they headed? Jango was already checking his scanner, jaw tight beneath his helmet. Southeast. Same direction as before. He looked up, and something in his stance shifted, not fear exactly, but the particular stillness of a man doing a calculation he didn't like the answer to. Toward the Lars homestead. Dooku's expression remained composed, but something calculating moved behind his eyes. The force-sensitive the core was hunting. You knew about that? I suspected. Dooku's force senses, honed over decades, had brushed against something unusual the moment he'd entered the structure, a signature the collective's own confused directives had inadvertently confirmed. A force sensitive of unusual strength, unknown to the Jedi Order, living in obscurity on a world the Council has never thought worth watching. Fascinating. He paused, weighing calculations. That had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with opportunity. If the collective assimilates her, whatever unique connection to the Force she possesses will be lost, folded into a hive mind, incapable of appreciating what it destroys. That would be a waste. Jango didn't have time for the Count's philosophical detours. We can still catch them if we move now. For a long moment, Dooku said nothing, and Jango watched the calculation play out across the Sith Lord's face. Political value. against personal safety, curiosity against caution. The same ruthless cost-benefit analysis that had guided every choice Dooku had made since abandoning the Jedi Order. Whatever conclusion he reached it quickly. Take your ship. I will follow in mine. If this woman is what I suspect she is, I intend to see for myself before the collective erases the evidence. They split, engines roaring against the storm's retreating winds, racing the remaining drones toward a homestead that had no idea what was converging on it from two directions at once. One force that wanted to destroy the woman inside, and one that wanted, for reasons entirely its own, to possess her. At the Lars homestead, Shmi Skywalker had not slept, had barely eaten, spending the hours since her warning pacing the length of the main room while Klieg kept watch from the porch with an old but well-maintained blaster rifle. Across his knees, Owen had returned from the Darklighter homestead an hour before dusk with confirmation that 3 other families had begun fortifying their own properties, spooked enough by second-hand reports of the Dorn family's disappearance to take Shmi's warning seriously despite its lack of concrete evidence. It was Owen who first heard the sound, a low mechanical whine, growing louder against the storm's dying wind, accompanied by something that made his skin crawl even before he could identify it. Footsteps, too many, too synchronized, moving with a rhythm no group of raiders or wildlife could produce. Something's coming, he said, voice tight, and Shmi felt it in the same instant. That wrongness from 2 nights before, no longer distant, no longer theoretical, but bearing down on the only home she had left in the galaxy. Klieg was on his feet instantly, rifle raised, shouting for Owen to seal the blast doors. But Shmi felt something else entirely beneath the fear, a strange, cold certainty that no amount of sealed doors would be enough against what was coming. The Force, usually a comfort, a quiet undercurrent she'd learned to trust across a lifetime of hardship, offered her nothing now but the same recoiling wrongness she'd felt in the wastes, magnified, focused, directed at her with an intent she couldn't yet name. The first drone breached the homestead's outer perimeter as the blast doors ground shut, tubules already extended, optical implants sweeping the courtyard with mechanical patience. Behind it, 3 more emerged from the storm's blowing sand, moving with the same terrible synchronization that had claimed a boy's identity 2 nights before in 90 seconds flat. Klieg fired first, dropping the lead drone with a shot to its optical core, but 2 more pressed forward undeterred, their plating already adapting to the frequency of his weapon's discharge. Owen joined the defense from the doorway, blaster fire lighting the courtyard in staccato bursts, buying seconds that felt, to Shmi, achingly insufficient against a threat that didn't tire, didn't fear, didn't stop. She pressed herself against the wall behind Klieg, every instinct screaming at her to run, to hide, to do anything but stand, exposed against something that had crossed a desert specifically to find her. And in the chaos of blaster fire and mechanical advance, she felt something shift inside her, old and unfamiliar, a pressure building beneath her ribs that had no name in any language she knew. The Force, which had only ever whispered to her in feelings and instincts, across a lifetime of quiet suffering, suddenly roared. The nearest drone reached for her, tubules extending with clinical precision, and Shmi Skywalker did something she had never done in 50-odd years of life on a world that had taken everything from her without ever once asking permission. She pushed back. It wasn't a conscious act, no training, no Jedi discipline, nothing but raw instinct channeled through a connection to the Force that had lain dormant and unrecognized her entire life, buried beneath the demands of survival and motherhood and quiet endurance. The drone's tubules, a hair's breadth from her exposed forearm, simply stopped, as though they'd struck an invisible wall, and the drone itself staggered backward, its optical implant flickering erratically, its chorus voice fracturing into something that sounded, for one strange moment, almost like static confusion. Biological signature, anomalous, assimilation parameters, rejecting. Klieg seized the opening without understanding its source, put a shot through the stumbling drone's central processor, and it dropped in a shower of sparks. But 2 more drones pressed forward through the gap, and Shmi felt the pressure building behind her ribs again, hot and unfamiliar, as though something in her had cracked open and could not now be closed. She didn't know what she was doing. She only knew that whatever the collectives, nanoprobes were built to interface with nervous systems, cellular structure, the ordinary architecture of biological life, her connection to the Force didn't fit that architecture at all. It was, to the collective's vast and cataloging mind, an error it had no framework to resolve. The second drone reached her a moment later, tubules piercing her sleeve before she could react, and Shmi cried out, not in the silence that had claimed the terrified teenager 2 nights before, but in genuine pain, as nanoprobes flooded into her bloodstream and immediately began broadcasting something back through the network that made every connected drone within range shudder in unison. Error cascades, feedback loops. Her force-saturated cells refused categorization, refused the neat biological templates the assimilation process depended on, and instead of converting her, the attempted assimilation began, catastrophically, to convert backward, raw, undirected force energy flooding into the drone's neural pathways through the very tubules meant to claim her. The drone convulsed, sparked, and collapsed, taking the feedback pulse with it into whatever remained of the fractured collective's local network. Shmi collapsed a heartbeat later, Klieg catching her before she hit the ground, her skin fever-hot, her breathing ragged. The tubule wound in her arm, already knitting, closed with an unnatural speed that owed nothing to any medical technology on the homestead. Owen dropped the last drone in the courtyard with a final, desperate shot. And then, abruptly, terrifyingly, silence fell, no more mechanical footsteps in the storm. No more chorus voices calling out designations and priorities. It was in that silence that 2 ships broke through the retreating sandstorm and set down at the homestead's perimeter, and Klieg Lars, cradling his unconscious wife with a blaster rifle still smoking in one hand, found himself facing down a bounty hunter in Mandalorian armor and a tall, cloaked figure whose bearing radiated an authority that made every survival instinct. Klieg possessed screamed danger. "Stand down," Dooku said, voice cool and measured despite the chaos of the last hour, his gaze already moving past Klieg to the unconscious woman in his arms with an intensity that made Klieg's grip on his rifle tighten instinctively. "I have no interest in you, farmer. I have considerable interest in her. She's my wife," Klieg said, and though his voice shook with exhaustion and adrenaline, he did not lower the rifle. "Whatever you want with her, you're not taking her anywhere." Jango Fett, watching from a few steps back, found himself in an unfamiliar position, caught between a contract's demands and something that had been building in him since the ravine 2 nights before, since watching a boy erased in 90 seconds, since realizing that the thing he'd been sent to investigate valued nothing about the individual lives it consumed. He said nothing yet, but his hand had not moved toward his weapon, and that hesitation, small as it was, would matter more than he yet understood. Dooku studied the standoff with the patient calculation of a man who had talked his way past far more dangerous obstacles than an exhausted moisture farmer with a blaster rifle. "I do not intend her harm," he said, which was, in its narrow way, true. "I intend to understand what I have just witnessed. Your wife's connection to the Force is unlike anything catalogued by the Jedi Order in a generation, perhaps longer. That is not a threat, farmer. That is an opportunity for her and for anyone wise enough to recognize its value." "She's not an opportunity," Klieg said. "She's a person." Something flickered behind Dooku's eyes at that. Not quite recognition. Not quite the philosophy he'd have voiced 10 years earlier as a Jedi Master, but some faint echo of it, quickly suppressed beneath the colder calculus of what he'd become. He said nothing further on the matter, instead turning his attention to the wound on Shmi's arm, the unnatural speed of its healing, the residual energy still crackling faintly along her skin like static. "After a storm, the collective's remaining drones will regroup," he said instead, changing the subject with the ease of a man accustomed to redirecting conversations to his advantage. "What remains of its core intelligence will not simply accept the loss of its most valuable target. If you wish to protect her, farmer, you would do well to accept help from those capable of providing it. However, unlikely the source. In the distance, past the storm's retreating edge, A faint green pulse flickered once against the dark horizon, wounded, fractured, but not yet extinguished, and every being standing in that courtyard understood, in their own way, that the night's true confrontation had not yet arrived. Shmi woke an hour before midnight to find her home occupied by a Sith Lord, a bounty hunter, and a silence that felt heavier than the storm that had preceded it. She woke, too, changed in ways she was only beginning to understand. The Force no longer a quiet undercurrent, but a living presence beneath her skin, humming faintly along nerve pathways that still ached from the tubules violation. Klieg had not left her side, and Owen stood watch at the doorway with the particular grim alertness of a boy who had, in one night, been forced to grow into something closer to a man. Dooku had used the intervening hour to study what remained of the fractured collective's local presence, drawing on both scanner data and his own considerable understanding of energy signatures, and what he'd learned had visibly sharpened his urgency. The core's destruction was not total, he informed the room, addressing Klieg and Shmi with the clipped efficiency of a military briefing, rather than a negotiation. A fragment of processing capacity survived, distributed now across what remains of its drones, perhaps a dozen units, no more. But a wounded collective is not a defeated one. It will attempt one final action, before what remains of its coherence fails entirely. What action? Shmi asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Consolidation, Dooku said. Every fractured intelligence I have studied, biological or otherwise, seeks unity before dissolution. It will gather its remaining drones and make one final attempt to assimilate. You, not for strategic value now, but because your Force signature represents the only variable its dying processes cannot resolve. You are, in its final calculus, an unanswered question it cannot bear to leave unanswered. It was Jango who spoke next, and something in his voice carried a weight that surprised even him. Then we don't wait for it to come to us. Dooku's eyebrow rose fractionally. A change of heart, Fett. A change of math. Jango's tone remained flat, professional, but the words that followed carried more conviction than any contract had ever demanded of him. I've killed a lot of things for a lot of credits. Never lost sleep over any of it. But I watched that thing erase a kid 2 nights ago like he never existed. And I'm not interested in watching it happen to anyone else while I stand around debating whether it's smart business. He looked at Klieg, at Shmi, at the fear and resolve in equal measure on both their faces. You want it dead permanently, we go to it. Tonight, before it finishes rebuilding whatever's left of its coordination. It was, Dooku reflected with something between irritation and grudging respect. The first time in years a hired gun had spoken to him, with more conviction than caution. But the logic was sound, and Dooku had not survived this long by ignoring sound logic simply because it arrived from an unwelcome source. They moved out an hour before dawn, Dooku, Jango, and to everyone's surprise, Shmi herself, who had refused every argument Klieg raised against her presence with a quiet, unshakable certainty that had not existed in her a week before. Whatever the Force had awakened in her during the assault, it had not made her reckless. It had made her certain, in a way that even Klieg's love for her could not override. They found what remained of the collective's presence a kilometer from the crash site, gathered in a loose defensive formation around a makeshift regeneration node, perhaps 15 drones, their movements less synchronized than before, betraying the coordination damage the fractured core had suffered. But damage did not mean harmless, and the ensuing battle tested every combatant to their limit. Dooku's lightsaber and Force lightning tore through the outer ranks with brutal efficiency, while Jango's jetpack and precision fire picked off drones attempting to flank from the structure's shadowed edges. But it was Shmi who proved, in the end, the battle's deciding factor, not through combat, but through presence. Every drone that came within meters of her faltered, its targeting systems flooding with the same error, cascades that had claimed the drone in her courtyard hours before. Its assimilation protocols, crashing against a biological signature the collective's dying intelligence, simply could not process. She did not fight. She simply stood, unafraid for the first time in a life defined by fear, and let her existence itself become the weapon that unmade her enemy's coherence piece by piece. The final drone fell as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern horizon. and with it, the last flicker of coordinated intelligence in what remained of the collective's local presence. Winked out, not destroyed entirely, perhaps. In some deeper sense, Dooku's scanners couldn't fully measure, but broken beyond any capacity to threaten Tatooine further. Dooku stood amid the wreckage, breathing hard, studying Shmi Skywalker with an expression that mixed calculation with something, almost like respect. "You have no formal training," he said. "No lightsaber, no Jedi philosophy. Nothing but raw instinct. And yet you unmade a threat that nearly killed me twice in as many nights." "I had something to protect," Shmi said simply. That was enough. Far to the south, in the shadow of the Junland cliffs, a band of Tusken raiders who had watched the green, light and mechanical horrors from a cautious distance for 3 nights finally began to withdraw deeper into the wastes, their traditional raiding grounds, contaminated by a threat their spears and gaffi sticks could never have answered, carrying with them, in whatever passed for their oral history, a warning about the night something worse than themselves had come to Tatooine, and something stranger still had driven it back into the dark. Dawn broke clean and gold over the Junlan wastes, and for the first time in 3 nights, the Force settled into something Shmi Skywalker recognized, not the wrongness that had haunted her sleep, but the ordinary, familiar quiet of a desert world at peace with itself. Dooku lingered only long enough to confirm what his scanners already suggested. The collective's remaining fragments had lost all coordinated intelligence, reduced to inert wreckage that would, in time, simply become more scrap for Jawa scavengers to strip and sell. He did not linger on sentiment, but before he departed, he paused before Shmi with an expression that seemed, briefly, to war between the Sith Lord's cold calculation and some quieter, older instinct he'd buried decades before. "The Jedi Order would call your strength a gift wasted on obscurity," he said. "I am inclined to agree, though for very different reasons than they would offer. Should you ever wish to understand what you are capable of, the galaxy is larger than this world, Shmi Skywalker." "I know what I'm capable of," Shmi said. "I proved that last night. I don't need the galaxy to tell me who I am." Dooku said nothing further, only inclined his head in something that might, in another man, have been respect, before returning to his shuttle and departing for Geonosis and the war he was already architecting, a war that would, in less than a year, engulf the galaxy. Shmi had just successfully defended without ever leaving her own doorstep. Jango lingered a moment longer, studying the woman who had, through nothing but presence and will, unmade a threat that had nearly claimed his life twice over. "Contract's done," he said finally, in place of whatever else might have been said. "Didn't expect to end it owing my life to a moisture farmer's wife. Won't forget it." He left without further ceremony, boarding slave I and disappearing into the brightening sky, carrying with him a rare, unspoken debt that would, in ways neither of them could yet foresee, echo forward into choices still years away. Shmi returned home to Klieg's arms and Owen's quiet, awed relief, and the Lars homestead settled. In the weeks that followed, back into the rhythms of ordinary desert life, moisture harvests, trade runs, the small triumphs and hardships of survival on a world that asked everything and forgave nothing. She never spoke of that night to Anakin in the brief, treasured transmissions they still occasionally exchanged. Some things, she decided, were hers alone to carry. But something in her had changed permanently, a quiet strength beneath the surface that Klieg noticed in small ways, a steadiness in her gaze, an unshakable calm in the face of hardship that even years of slavery had never fully given her. Whatever the Force had awakened in the courtyard that night remained, dormant but present, a promise she carried forward into a future still unwritten. The Tusken Raiders, driven from their traditional grounds by 3 nights of mechanical horror, would not return to raid the Lars homestead. 4 years to come, a delay that meant nothing and everything, rewriting a tragedy the galaxy had never known it avoided. Far above Tatooine, unnoticed by anyone still breathing on its surface, a final fragment of signal, buried deep in wreckage no scanner had thought to search, pulsed once into the dark of space, faint and dying, carrying with it a single unresolved directive into the endless silence between stars. Designation unprecedented. Assimilation incomplete. Somewhere, something was still listening. May the Force be with you.